Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel. Today's video is going to be about my favorite books of 2019. I know it's a bit late. I didn't plan on actually doing this video some months ago, but things have changed and now I'm standing here and I really want to go through some of the titles that I really appreciated from last year, because maybe some of you might be inspired to also pick up these books. I read a total of 61 books last year, which is a bit low for me. I mean, normally in the past few years, I have been reading about 120 books on average every year. So 61 is pretty low for me. I am happy about this number because last year I didn't want to push myself when it comes to reading. I wanted to only read when I felt like it, so 61 seems like a really good number to me. But I will say that this year my reading has picked up again and I'm already way ahead of my reading goal, so more about that later. But for now, let me just tell you that I have, I think, 13 titles written down in my notebook. Even though I only read 61 books last year, I have found 13 titles that stood out to me and that I really appreciated. I focus mainly on books that taught me things or that surprised me or that still stick in my head today, even though it's been almost a year since I read them. So these are the titles that fit that category. And yeah, let's just get started because I'm pretty excited to talk about these books. I'm going to go in order. So I'm starting with the first book of my favorites that I read last year. I think it was actually the first book I read last year, and that is Becoming by Michelle Obama, a memoir, a biography on her life from she was a child until she became the president's wife, the first lady of the United States. I was surprised by this book. First of all, Michelle can write. I mean, she was so prolific in her writing. It wasn't stiff or too formal in any way, which you might expect from a person who is not a writer, who is married to a politician. I don't know if that's stupid of me to say, but basically I was surprised by her writing. And also I really loved how this book gives you a unique insight into what it's like to be the first lady of the president of the USA. I mean, who gets to write this kind of book? Not many people, and I for one love to read it, so this one definitely had to go on my list. Another book that had to go on my list is one that I actually own, and that is A Letter to the Sky by John Boyne. I really love John Boyne and his adult fiction. I haven't read too much of his young adult fiction yet, but I might do that someday. This one I particularly liked because it's about this aspiring author who wants to do anything, and I mean anything, in order to get to the top of his career. It was brutal, it was surprising, but also fascinating. It was kind of like with horror movies, where you don't really want to watch them because you know you're going to get scared and it's going to be so macabre, but you still are drawn to this story. You want to see what's going to happen because you can't help it. I felt that way with this book. It was way too brutal and also a bit too exaggerated, but I bought it, I loved it nevertheless, and I found it fascinating enough to put it on my favorites list. I'm going to go through the books pretty quickly, as you can see, because I do have 13 titles to talk about and I don't want for this video to be way too long. So next on the list is another book which I actually don't own a physical copy of because I borrowed the copy I read from a friend. But I do have another book by this author. This is a Danish author. I'm sorry for you guys who are not Danes and who cannot get access to this author yet. He might be translated into English in some years, some months, I don't know. But basically, Morten Pape, I'm actually not sure how to pronounce his surname. But this is his second book, which I also read last year. This is not my favorite. My favorite one is Plain, this one. But I just want to show you that it's basically the same size of this book. and the two books have a lot in common, but I did prefer Plain, which is basically about Morten's own childhood growing up in this area in Copenhagen called Plain, in which people from suffering families, poor families, grow up, and it's kind of hard to explain. It's this area in Copenhagen where they built a lot of apartments for poor people and people at risk. It's also about his school and how he was so used to foreign people that became criminals, that it became part of his everyday life, and it became part of his childhood very much. It's also about his father and mother who are divorced. It's about his sibling, and it's about a lot of things. Basically, I love this book because it gave me once again a unique insight into what it can also be like to be a child here in Denmark. I did not grow up like this, fortunately, but I could still recognize a lot of things from his childhood in my childhood. Not the bad things, but just the way our society works and the way we talk and think and grow up. So I definitely like this book a lot, and it had to be on this list. This one was good as well. This is more of a fiction work, but also based on his own life. So definitely check out Morten Pape if you haven't already, as a Dane. Next, let me see, I have Daisy Jones and the Six by Taylor Jenkins Reid. I mean, this book was on a lot of people's favorite list of last year, mine as well, because I actually preferred this one to the other popular ones he wrote, the one about Seven Husbands of Evelyn Hugo. I mean, I like that one as well, but not nearly as much as Daisy Jones. This book I love because it's basically about a group of music, a rock music group, and it's about the members. But the thing that I loved about it is that it was written through interviews, but you really got to know these characters really well. You felt like they were real characters, and I was fascinated as to how Taylor Jenkins Reid was able to actually make these characters come alive through not dialogue, but through interviews. This was so unique. I think you will find that unique is a word that comes across in a lot of my favorite books. It was really good entertainment in the end, and I felt for the characters, as I was saying, so this one had to be on my list as well. Next we have Pachinko by Min-Jin Lee. I finally managed to read this book last year. It's a pretty huge novel. It's about 500 pages, and the reason I was hesitant to pick it up for a few months is because it was big. I wasn't sure the story was going to be for me because it seemed to be about multiple generations, and that's it. I didn't know anything else besides from that, and I wasn't sure that was enough to actually make me pick up this huge of a book, but I did in the end, and I am so thankful I did, because this book was amazing. I was hooked from the beginning. I loved everything about it. I don't remember not loving anything about this book. It is about multiple generations, but it's set in Asia. I can't remember whether it's Japan or China. I'm not sure now actually, but it's also about the society of this country. It's about making choices in your life, loving people, losing people, being in doubt. It's one of those narratives that I'm a sucker for. I loved to read about people, just plain people, and this was definitely it. So thankfully I picked up this book and I loved it, and I so recommend it to every one of you. And I could say basically the same thing about the next book. It's a huge novel. I think it's about 900 if not 1,000 pages. This one is Forever Amber by Kathleen Winsor. I'd had my eyes on it for a few months, but I wasn't sure I was going to actually read it because it's so huge. I bought it, I read it, I loved it to pieces. This one is more of a historical novel, and historical fiction novel. It's set in London or around London, and it follows our main character Amber, who is this naive girl when we meet her, but she's also very provocative and she wants to go out into the world and escape her rural world where she's living now. So she goes to London in search for happiness as she sees it. The thing is that she lives in London during the Great Fire and during the plague, for instance. So it's also a historical account on what happened in London back in the days, but told through the eyes of a fictional character. I loved it. I mean, 1,000 pages, that one was easily read. I think I read it over 3 weeks because I took my time with it, but there was no time during those 3 weeks in which I felt bored or didn't want to read it. I mean, I just devoured it, and that's always a good sign when reading a book. Then we have a very different kind of book. This is How It Always Is by Laurie Frankel. My mother actually also read this book because I gave it to her as a birthday gift, and she loved it as well. I don't know if that says anything, but it's another one of those books that's about plain people and family, but this one comes with a twist. And the thing that makes me put this book on my favorites list is that it taught me about what it feels like to be born in a wrong body, born with the wrong gender, when you don't feel like the gender you are born into, how that shows in your childhood and in your life, and how that affects everyone around you, especially your family. This one was just fascinating. I don't know too much about this topic, so naturally I want to learn more about it, and this book I think did give me an insight into what it's like to grow up like this, what struggles you have to overcome, what questions you start asking, and how you start living this new life of yours. Completely fascinating. It had to be on my list. Next, we have another Danish book, which I really hope will be translated into English very soon, because it's set partly in America and partly in Denmark. So it might become an English bestseller as well. This one is Lone Star by Mathilde Walter Clark. And actually, if I had to choose one book from last year which I loved the most, this is it. So this is about a Danish girl, or a Danish woman now, called Mathilde, who decides to write this book, which is partly fiction, partly autobiography, because she starts thinking about her father, who lives in America. He is an American. Mathilde's mother is Danish, and that's why she is settled in Denmark, but she hardly ever sees her father, who is, as I said, living in America. She starts thinking about him because he's becoming old. I think he's about 70 something years old in this book. And she starts fearing that if he ever dies, how will she ever know? Because she has no contact with his family or with him. She feels very eliminated from his life, and she starts worrying naturally that she will never hear from him again. So she reaches out to him, and then this book becomes an account of her childhood, in which she spent her summers in America and how she experienced that, but also about how she finds her father again and reconnects with him, and how they go to Texas and start exploring his childhood and her childhood and start sharing all of these lovely thoughts and experiences. I love this book to pieces. I mean, this was so perfect for me. If you like the kind of books that I like, I think you will definitely like this one. It's a memoir, but it's also fiction, and I can't say enough positive things about this book. I also had a few rereads last year, which I had to put on this list. Even though I've already read them and put them on other favorites list, I think they deserve another mention. And I'm talking about, first of all, A Little Life by Hanya Yanagihara. This one, I mean, I don't want to spend too much time talking about it. It's a lot of people's favorite. I see why. I mean, it's a book that teaches you empathy with a capital E. And this second reread was no exception. This book broke me. I had forgotten parts of it, and it was kind of a new experience reading it again, because, as I said, I had forgotten parts of it, and those parts came back to me and surprised me and broke my heart. It was such a phenomenal reading experience, so that I mean, I read it again, I loved it again. I had to put it on my favorites list again. And the other book I reread last year and had to put on this list again is Gone with the Wind by Margaret Mitchell. This one, I mean, I have no words. I think you've heard of it, maybe you don't like it, maybe you do. I'm one of those people who loves it because it's just, once again, a phenomenal read. It's a 1000-page narrative, but it's so worth the read. It's so worth the time and the investment. It's a book about America during the Civil War, and it's just a beautiful, beautiful story with the most frustrating main character whom I love other ways. So definitely check out this book if you haven't already. Now back to some of the books I read for the first time last year. I do have another Danish author that well, actually she's also Norwegian, but I had to put her in this video because I read all of her books recently, and this one in particular was the first one I read by her. It surprised me so much so that I immediately went out and read the rest of her books. This one is Hvor der er fugle by Maren Uthaug. Well, actually, this could be translated into Where There's Birds. And it comes from this proverb here in Denmark in which we say, where there's birds, there is fish. It's basically about how people act in special circumstances, how we focus on some things and how that draws other people to the things happening. I don't know if I'm explaining myself very well, I'm probably not. This one is unique because it takes place in a lighthouse. It's about this family of 3 who live in a lighthouse in Norway. The father works the lighthouse and they are basically separated from the rest of society for several months. That alone was fascinating to read about, but it's also about society in general. How rumors spread, how things get entwined, how bad things happen that lead to secrets and doubts. And I was also very much surprised by the plot twists in this book, which I didn't see coming all the way, and it was just a really fascinating read. So definitely my favorite book by this author. I also have this one signed by her, and she drew a little cat, which is Zeus, because I told her about my cat. I have 2 more books left. The next one being Small Fry by Lisa Brennan Jobs, who is the daughter of Steve Jobs, the big guy from Apple. This is another memoir. I tend to really love memoirs. This one was no exception. It's about this small girl, Lisa, who tells about her childhood growing up without her father, because basically Steve Jobs was not a really great father to her. She mainly grows up with her mother, and her father is not in the picture really. He does appear once in a while, and when he does, he acts in really strange ways. So basically this is a personal account of what it was like to grow up like this, with this man who was such an icon to everyone else in the world, and people saw him as a hero, but really he wasn't that much of a hero in his daughter's eyes. Definitely a great book. I was surprised how much I loved it. It was really well written as well, and that's always a great thing when you read a memoir about a person, because it's so much easier to read memoirs like these when they are written well. And the very last book I want to mention is actually a trilogy which has taken a lot of people by storm here in BookTube. I finally managed to read the Nevernight Chronicles by J. Christoph. It's a young adult trilogy. No, back up. It's an adult trilogy, but it kind of reads a little bit like young adult, I would say, because it's fantasy. It reads like candy. It has a lot of action in it. It has a lot of intrigue and blood as well, and it's just a fast-paced trilogy, which, as I said, I read it like candy. I loved how it has so many plot twists that kept the action going, and I loved just the main character, but also the other characters. I really loved the world. There were a lot of things about this trilogy that I really liked. The first book was my favorite, second book was my next favorite, and then the last book was a great conclusion. But all in all, great candy for when you need a book to read that is easily read and that draws you into so much. I mean, I can't even explain it. And that's it for my favorites list of 2019. I'm glad I finally was able to do this video. And I hope you enjoyed it as usual. Let me know in the comments if you've read any of the books that I've talked about and what you thought of them. I really hope you liked them as well, but if you didn't, that's okay as well. No spoilers, obviously. But thank you so much for watching and have a great day, everyone. Despite the desperate times we're living in, maybe some of these books will allow for you to escape a little bit if you decide to pick them up. Have a great day, everyone, and happy reading.